fellow homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. Welcome to Miles Away Farm. My name is Jennifer, and tonight we are making skillet green beans. I know I've mentioned in other videos, sorry, my butter is frozen here, that I was a super picky eater as a kid, and there were very few things that I liked to eat in terms of vegetables. One of them happened to be canned green beans. I liked canned green beans. I did not like fresh green beans, and that was all there was to it. I still really love canned green beans, weirdly. It's one of the few pressure canned vegetables that I actually make and enjoy. But I did finally learn how to eat fresh green beans in a way that I enjoyed them. And weirdly, it kind of started at a restaurant. A friend of mine, old high school friend, had taken me to lunch. I was visiting near where I grew up. And on the menu with the lunch that I had came some green beans that had been cooked somehow. I don't know how they've been cooked, but they were really long, thin green beans, the kind that you would normally call like French filet beans. And I ate them with my fingers, and I actually really enjoyed them. That was the first time I'd ever eaten. A couple of these are past their prime. It was the first time I'd ever eaten a green bean where I actually was like, oh, this is what people get excited about. Now I understand. All right, we'll grab a few more out of another bag that I've got here. I've been a member of Cooks Illustrated and America's Test Kitchen since the late 90s, and they had a recipe for a skillet green bean that I tried, and I really enjoyed it. And so I finally found a way to enjoy fresh green beans. And that has actually been my goal with all vegetables, is to find a recipe for every vegetable out there that I don't just, manage to eat, but actually look forward to. And I've got go-to recipes for most of them. And so over, the next year or so on our channel, we'll go through and make a lot of those recipes. It helps you expand your horizons. If you've got one go-to recipe for carrots, if you've got one go-to recipe for cauliflower, if you've got one go-to recipe for broccoli, you're not as likely to avoid it in other things, and it kind of starts expanding what you're willing to eat. Anyway, sorry, that was a long-winded explanation, but we're making skillet green beans tonight. These are green beans from my garden. There's 3 different kinds. This is dragon's tongue, which is I forget what they call this, but basically a flat type of green bean. They're Italian typically. And then the other 2 one is Maxabel from Johnny's, and then the other one is a kind of a tried and true standard, which is called Provider. And they're all bush varieties. Our climate here, pole varieties don't do as well. Pole varieties take longer to mature. You get a longer harvest because they keep producing, but they take quite a bit longer to actually start producing green beans. And what happens in our climate is it gets hot pretty quickly, and pole beans don't produce a lot or set a lot of fruit when it's super hot. And so I get good production of plants, but I don't tend to get a lot of green beans off of pole beans. So I've quit trying to grow them. And so I just grow bush varieties. I actually love pole beans just because it's so much easier to pick when you don't have to squat down. And so I would prefer to grow pole beans. However, not happening. And then my bush beans that I put in this year, I put them too close to some summer squash that I had, and so I've only been getting a handful every couple days when I go out. And green beans don't store super well, and so some of these have been in the fridge just a hair too long. However, I ended up losing several of those squash plants to squash bugs and some kind of a virus, and so now my green beans, that one's just way too mature. Now my green beans are actually finally starting to put on a crop. Here we are in early September. So yeah, it's been a weird green bean year. But 3 different varieties in here. I'm just cutting off the tops. and checking for quality here. And then I know I have another bag. I actually harvested quite a few the other day when they were finally starting to come on again. And so I'm gonna pull a couple of extras out for the ones that I had to toss here. That one's too big. The other thing I've never been able to just enjoy is eating green beans raw, right out of the garden. I know a lot of people do that, and it's just not my thing. I don't love them raw. I do freeze them every year and then throw them into stir fries and other things later in the year. They do freeze pretty well. You need to blanch them first. But I always have a bag of frozen green beans on hand. And then occasionally, if I've got enough production, I will pressure can a couple of jars. But mostly I like to eat them fresh, in season, like most things. You know, I spend a lot of time thinking about food preservation, and then a lot of times I just don't get to eating the things I preserve because I eat really seasonally. And so we have enough production of seasonal stuff that I am not looking for what to eat in January, because I've still got onions and I've still got squash and potatoes and then things like that. So yeah, I often don't get to my canned veggies as much as I should. That said, though, they're great for camping. We're going to be going camping next week. And so it's really great to be able to take shelf-stable stuff like that when you're camping. So I'll bring canned potatoes. I'll probably bring some canned corn and some canned black beans and some canned salsa. And one of the dinners that we'll have will just be like a black beans salsa with corn, maybe nachos or something. Yeah, those kind of convenience foods when you're camping is so great because it's so, you don't have to do a lot of dishes. I'm probably adding more in here than I threw out earlier, but we're just going to use them. And these haven't been rinsed, but I'm not worried about it. They're pretty darn clean. Romesco. I think the name for the flat type of bean is Romesco, if I'm remembering right. So I've got my skillet going over here on really low heat to melt that butter. That butter was frozen out of the right out of the freezer, and so I knew it was going to take a little bit to melt it. The other thing we're going to need here is some garlic. And I think the original recipe calls for like 6 cloves. That seems excessive to me, so I'm not going to do that many. You do you. The biggest thing with storing green beans as you're picking them out of your garden, if you're not going to get to them for a couple of days, is do not pick them when they're wet, and do not rinse them until you're ready to use them. The more moisture that is on them, the shorter their lifespan. They will rot really quickly and get slimy in the fridge if they're stored with a lot of humidity. So keeping them dry makes a lot of difference. And I would guess out of these that we just went through, some of these are well over a week old, which is pretty good for something like a green bean. So we did all right. I lost a few. I've been trying to get to this recipe quite literally for a week. And we've just had so many other things coming in from the garden and vying for our attention that I haven't had time to do it. You know, that's the thing about making content is you make it and then you got to eat it, and there's only 2 of us, and so if I'm making something, sometimes we just need to eat leftovers for a couple of days. Okay, so we've got our butter in here. I'm keeping my heat pretty low because I really don't want this butter to burn, which is really easy to do. The milk fats that are in the butter will burn quite quickly. I'm going to add our garlic and get that slowly cooking. A lot of times when I'm making a stew or something, I'll just go ahead and throw the residual in there because it disappears. But in this particular case, because these are fresh, and it's just, there's going to be like a wad of garlic sticking onto a bean, I'm going to not do that this time and just rinse that out. Right, I always rinse my garlic press right after I use it. It slows things down a little bit, but it is so much better than trying to clean it after that garlic is dried in those holes. To our garlic, we're going to add a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And I'm leaving this heat kind of low, and we're just trying to toast that garlic. So just getting it going. A little longer than you would normally spend. Normally this is like a 30-second process. We're going to give this a minute or two, because we're actually looking, I think, for a little bit of texture on there where we toast it. This smells so good, you guys. While that's happening, we can measure out our other ingredients here. I need just a pinch of red pepper flakes. I think it calls for 1/8 teaspoon. We like chili, so we're not going to be bothered by that at all. You could leave that out if it was bothering you. And it calls for a teaspoon of fresh thyme. The idea of picking a teaspoon of fresh thyme leaves off of thyme makes me want to cry. So I'm going to use dried thyme, and I'm just going to cut that amount in half. General rule of thumb is half the amount if you're using dried rather than fresh. In this container is 2 teaspoons of all-purpose flour. We're going to make a bit of a sauce out of this, so that's where that's coming in, but that all goes in together. I also need a cup of chicken broth. Every recipe on the planet calls for low sodium chicken broth and then has you add a bunch of salt. I think just buy regular chicken broth and then don't use as much salt. Don't know, they all say it's so that you can control how salty it is, but I don't know, I find it fussy. This is better than bouillon. I use the organic brand. It's the equivalent of using chicken stock. Cooks Illustrated, America's Test Kitchen has done many, many tests on this stuff, and it's really decent. It's shelf stable in the fridge pretty much forever. And you don't have to have like cartons of chicken stock that are half full and going bad and that can't be recycled. So I've literally been using this stuff for 15 years. I really, really like it as a product. I actually make my own chicken stock as well, but that's in pint containers. And since I only need a cup, I'm just going to go ahead and use store-bought instead. Oh, now that garlic's starting to smell really good. And I'm realizing this recipe actually called for 1.5 pounds of green beans, and we have probably 1.25 pounds there, but I'm not going to worry about it. It'll be a little extra saucy, not going to hurt anything. The trick to this recipe is you are basically steaming or boiling the green beans in chicken stock, and then once that chicken stock evaporates off, you get a little bit of fry. I can't remember how it works. I think you fry and then you add the chicken stock and then you boil most of it off and it makes a sauce. That's how it works. So it's a 2-step process. You do need to have a lid that fits your skillet, at least somewhat. Notice how we're starting to get a little brown there. That's what we're looking for. We do not want that to burn. We're going to add in our flour mixture. And basically we're making a roux. This is flour and butter together in a pan is the beginnings of a roux. And so that's what's happening here. You can see that foaming. That's what you want to see. Cooking off that raw flour flavor. Oh, that thyme smells great. That thyme just woke up really good. So now we add our green beans. Give everybody a good little tossy toss. Just to distribute some of that lovely garlic flavor. All right, now we're going to add our chicken stock because I really don't want this garlic in here to burn. All right. So we are going to put a lid on this. Turn our heat up a little bit. And we're going to let that steam and cook in there for about 4 minutes. All right, our timer has gone off. Let's give this a Quick stir and see how it looks. We're looking for tender crisp here in terms of these beans. So we want the rawness to be cooked out of them, but we still want them to have some texture. We are not going for canned green bean texture here. And that looks pretty good. So now we cook this for another 4 minutes with the lid off so that the sauce thickens up and that they continue to cook a bit. All right, we'll be back in another 4. All right, our timer is going. See how we're doing here? You can see a lot of that water in the chicken stock has evaporated. And we're starting to get what looks like a pretty nice little pan sauce, and that's what we're after.